I'm going to hear from Catherine Delahunty.
Mr. Chair, I really appreciate this opportunity, having spent the last hour on my back coughing when I would have liked to have been critiquing. However, now is my one chance. I'm going to have a go. I recognise that where we've got to is the commencement and the title of the bill, and I'm really disappointed to be standing here at all on this particular issue, but it's par for the course, and I don't think that the children will get used to it, and I think that's the point. It's not actually about the business agenda, it's actually about our kids. So let's have a look at the title. I would agree with some of my colleagues that there should be a change of title. Education Amendment Bill is a meaningless and innocuous title for something which is really the Charter for Disasters title. I'd like to call it the Charters for Disasters Bill. Or accountability is just a secret bill, because that's really what it is all about. It's about a disaster for education, and it's about secrecy in terms of contracting, which may be perfectly acceptable for some businesses, but actually has no bearing on our education for our kids. So the title is misleading and disingenuous, not unusual in Parliament, but this one in particular does not tell the public what it is that's happening here, which is probably one of the most profound shifts in the history of education legislation away from what it says at Part 1, free primary and secondary education. Free is such an interesting word, Mr. Chair, and free is what the schools in Britain are called, that's their title, free schools. And in America, they're called charter schools. And both those words, when we're talking about the title of this bill, need to be considered, because Aotearoa New Zealand in the 1980s introduced charters for every single school. What we didn't do is introduce secrecy, privatisation, unregistered teachers, no boards of trustees, any hours that the school chooses to set, a contract which is only with the government, a sponsor who has no educational background, and so on and so on. So that's what charter meant to the citizens of this country. And it wasn't perfect. Tomorrow's Schools has its critics, and there are things we need to do for it. But rather than chucking that out, what's happening is an undermining through this really odd initiative that has failed elsewhere, and at the very best in all the research can be called mixed in terms of its results. So, you know, let's call a spade in the title of a bill. I think it would be a refreshing change, and so I think that perhaps we should call the bill Throw Away the Rule Book, because the rule book around what works for an equitable public quality education system is being undermined by this, what I also like to call the bill is Privatisation Trojan Horse Education Amendment Bill, because it's actually a Trojan horse for a fascinating speech that Heather Roy made some time ago, which I wrote a blog about called Bad News from Bunnythorpe. She made it in Bunnythorpe, which is a sort of interesting place to announce the end of quality public education, but it sort of sums up the way of life in this country in some ways, is that disastrous educational policy will be whispered in an obscure small town called Bunnythorpe. I'm sure a very good place, but did they need Heather Roy announcing that vouchers and privatisation was the solution to education? That was prior to the election. Then we had the cup of tea, then we have the coalition agreement, and now we have disaster legislation which will undermine something that's very, very important to people in this country, which is the concept of a local school being good enough for all children. And I'm not saying, and no one is, that we cannot innovate and improve the quality of public education system that we have. Of course we can. And I don't think anybody wants to deny that there are real issues from poverty, from disadvantage, from the growing gap between the richest and the poorest families attending schools, and the need for a much greater level of cultural responsiveness in the diversity of Aotearoa. That's always been needed. But we do have special character of legislation, clauses in our legislation, our education legislation. We do have a whole range of mechanisms such as kura kaupapa that need resourcing. And so if you're going to talk about the title of a bill, we should really be honest and say that this bill is not about any of the stated goals which we hold dear around free primary and secondary education. It's about facilitating business. So the bill could perhaps be called the Business Facilitation and Education Bill. I've had a look at some of the international groups have expressed interest in setting up charters in their franchises. So it's basically an opportunity for international educational franchises to take over. Another opportunity is there for unqualified teachers, particularly those, and this is what we heard at the Select Committee, which is why the title is mild and misleading. What we heard was that if you have failed to keep your registration, not you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if there has been a failure to keep your registration up to date, or you have committed some kind of misdemeanour, which the Teachers' Council is concerned about, don't worry, you'll be able to go. The person will be able to go and teach in a charter school. So we're going to have this bizarre scenario where half the teachers in a school, or less, there's no requirement for a particular number to be registered, will be registered, and the others won't, and we won't know why, and the parents won't know why. And that is the government's idea of accountability in education. That is the government's idea of safety for our children. It is extremely odd and totally inconsistent that they're building this into the Education Amendment Act as it is titled. So I'm very concerned about these titles. I think that as well as unregistered teachers being allowed access through this bill, the title could also be good at learning, good at lecturing, you can easily be a teacher. Because what I heard at the Select Committee from some people is they didn't even understand, not the submitters, but other members of the committee, they didn't understand the huge difference between lecturing quantum physics at a university and facilitating children's learning in a primary school. And so the idea was from some people that you could just hijack some lecturers from a university who had a degree, throw them into a charter school, and then everything will be fine. And of course 6-year-olds will really enjoy being lectured, because lecturing is learning to some people. It just shows you what they don't know about learning. The most offensive thing about this Education Amendment Bill and its title is that it does not expose the fact that children's learning is not well served by privatisation and competition. I would much prefer that we just call it the competition bill. The league table is the way to go. The sports team model for education, which says that we should all be in league tables, we should all compete, because people learn best by competing. Mr. Chair, that is worse than a fallacy. It's incredibly destructive. And there is plenty of evidence of that all over the world when you read into the evidence about the creation of these so-called free, so-called charter, so-called helpful for educational schools. I'm also very concerned about the idea that perhaps a person could finish their university degree in any subject, be considered an expert, and then be hijacked into a school where they had 6 weeks training. Charter schools will be well positioned to take those people, but it won't work for kids. So we have a bill that is called Education Amendment, and is supposedly about free primary and secondary education, but it creates risk. It creates risk for parents trying to decide what will be sustainable, because if the schools fall over, and they often do in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, if they fall over, then your child has been mucked around. And people are vulnerable about what's going to be best for their kids' education. They need to know. Christchurch yesterday is a case in point. There is huge vulnerability. There is not a need for lab rat experimentation. So therefore, the title of this bill really needs to change, and it really needs to be, I think my favourite is the Trojan horse one, actually. I think the Trojan horse one is my favourite because it's, yes, it is educational. It sort of inspires history. We think about what happened in Troy when the wooden horse was rolled through and everybody was smiling, thinking the siege was over. But the siege wasn't over. The siege was just beginning. And that's what we see in the title of this bill, as an innocuous title, when the siege of Troy, after years of the battle, has just begun, and out of the wooden horse will come the warriors of privatisation, who will break it open and create an amazingly well-resourced experiment, which no doubt the government in its first few years will refuse to allow to fail, whatever the definition of success is. And I certainly don't think that competition will work for these kids. The experience overseas in terms of this bill is that they counsel out students who don't fail because it's a contract, and if you fail to meet the contract, it's over. It is over. That is what is so destructive from the student's point of view. I'm sure it won't fail in the first few years because it'll be heavily resourced. But we could have done a whole lot better with that 19 million we wasted in the budget on this. We could have done a whole lot better with our ethos around education. And we could have stuck to the title of the Education Act, the right to free primary and secondary education, and we should add some words. If the Green Party was going to amend the Education Act, we would add words around creating a quality, local, culturally responsive and equitable public system for the benefit of all students. We would not play games with the future of our children for business.
Melissa Lee.
Move that the question be now put.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Chairman, I appreciate this. This is my first call on this bill.